The nexus between climate change, the damage that does, and how that then in turn influences energy policy was a theme in that particular story. And it's pretty much the same thing with our next one. Kenya's finance ministry is exploring a range of either new or higher taxes on fossil fuels as part of efforts to meet the country's emissions reduction strategy. Now, according to the latest details available to us through the IMF, options being considered include the introduction of a carbon tax, or raising excise taxes that already apply on fossil fuels like petrol, diesel, kerosene and natural gas. Now, if implemented, the fund says these could raise additional tax revenues while also potentially providing a resource pool to compensate vulnerable groups that will be hit by higher prices. Now, the precise details, however, of how this carbon tax would apply and at what rate are yet to be decided. But here's the thing, though. At a time when Kenya has seen days of demonstrations, partly in response to extra taxes levied by the 2023 Finance Act, want a carbon tax in a country where roughly 80% of electricity comes from renewables dent its competitiveness even further. That was part of the questions I put to Joseph Nganga, CEO of the Africa Climate Summit. That event will be held here in the country in early September.
While we are talking about the future and how we need to engage, that does not mean that existing challenges should not be addressed. And we are therefore at the summit continuing to advocate for the Loss and Damage Fund, for support to countries that needs the appropriate support, that they should not be borrowing to address climate crisis, that this should be an action that is supported by those who have had a hand in polluting to help the countries that are facing that brunt address the challenges. But what's more exciting about the Africa Climate Summit is, in addition to that, which we all agree is important but not sufficient, in addition to that, and forward-looking, we have an opportunity collectively as the world to take our individual strengths, bring them to the table, and together address the climate crisis.
Indeed. I want to go back to the loss and damages question, because that came out as one of the signature achievements, if we'd like to call it that, from COP27 last year. The agreement was, OK, let's set up the fund, but the mechanics of how that fund would work, that wasn't agreed on. So from the perspective of the Africa Climate Summit, are there specific positions on how African countries would like the fund to be financed and for it to work in terms of how to disburse whatever money does come into it?
The beauty of the Africa Climate Summit is we are holding it alongside Africa Climate Week, and the expectation is that some discussions will be held specifically at the summit and some at Climate Week. And I anticipate that the mechanics of the Loss and Damage Fund, which are really critical to the fund being properly capitalized, but then deploying the capital appropriately, will be part of the discussion between the summit and the Climate Week, which we will then be bringing into COP28.
All right, then 10 days ago, the U.S. climate envoy, John Kerry, said, and I believe this was in testimony to legislators in the U.S., he says, the United States will not, and I'm quoting him here, under any circumstances, end quote, pay reparations to countries hit by climate change disasters. Now, that's barely a year after we agreed on setting up a loss and damages fund. Doesn't that essentially suggest the loss and damages idea is almost dead on arrival?
Well, without getting into geopolitics, the reality is that this is a global conversation. And while the US is a significant economy, it's not the only actor. I also think that there is room to go back and revisit that statement and where it came from. The reality is there has been pollution. That pollution has caused challenges to parts of the world, and it is a moral and collective responsibility to address what has happened in the past while also being forward-looking. So I believe that there is room for that conversation to be had, even in the context of such remarks.
I want to go back to the question around taxes, specifically carbon taxes, because you see that conversation coming up over and over again, at least in some economies. I know it's been part of conversations between Kenya and the IMF as part of its current program. South Africa is talking about carbon taxes as well. But within the context of, making the assumption that that is a fairly straightforward one, let's assume for the sake of argument that this money doesn't show up, right, from foreign sources in the next 3-5 years. What tax policies can government implement, be that tax cuts, tax incentives, to try and essentially nudge their economies, as fragile as they are, onto a path of a low emission growth path without relying on foreign capital? Is that feasible?
I think I will start by saying that given the climate crisis, it's not optional. We have to change how we finance climate, and we have to very aggressively address climate finance in a view to mitigate the climate impacts. And to do that, carbon taxes are one instrument. But His Excellency, the President of Kenya, President Ruto, uses an analogy where if you're in a building and you have air conditioning in your corner, but the whole building is burning, we are all going to burn. So the idea that by having a country-specific carbon tax is adequate to address a global challenge is insufficient at best.
But the counter argument that business people here will probably make is, hang on, we didn't scorch the planet. We're not responsible for these massive emissions. Someone else is. So if we impose carbon taxes, especially on fragile economies like ours, that's limiting our competitiveness, that's limiting our ability to grow, that's limiting our ability to essentially raise money in the market in the way that we would like. How would you respond to that counter argument?
I think there are two parts to it. If you think about a country like South Africa and its carbon footprint across its manufacturing industries, which are some of the most advanced on the continent, if South Africa does not address its carbon footprint along its value chains, it will not be able to be competitive globally. So as a country, there is an incentive to go green to ensure that South Africa remains competitive from a global perspective. But I then go back to my earlier point, which is this is not about one country taking a measure or a region taking a measure. It's about all of us collectively thinking about what we can do as a collective action to address the climate crisis.